If you walked into your garden last June and found your tomatoes stripped down to bare stems overnight, I want you to listen carefully for the next 10 minutes. Because what I am going to tell you costs about $4 at any pharmacy. And it is the same thing a retired postal worker named Harold Beasley used in Millbrook, Indiana, every Sunday morning for 41 years. My name is Eli, and I have been growing tomatoes the old way for 40 years. I am going to tell you something the seed companies will never print on the back of a packet. I am going to show you the exact ratio. I am going to show you the 1,950 Purdue study that was pulled from circulation, and I am going to show you why your county extension office has never once mentioned this to you. Stay with me until I tell you about the cardboard box marked Roots that a graduate student's daughter found in his attic, because that box is what convinced me this was real. 2 spoons of Epsom salt, 1 gallon of warm water. That is the whole secret, and before you tell me it is too late this season, it is not. You can start this Sunday on whatever you have already planted. The plants you put in 3 weeks ago will respond within 14 days. This is for the garden you already have, in the backyard you already own, with the plants already in the ground. Not a new plot. Not next year. This Sunday. Now let me tell you about Harold. Harold had a 6th grade education. He was not a chemist. He was not a botanist. He had hands gnarled like roots from decades of sorting mail in an unheated rural post office. But every Sunday at 6 in the morning, from April through September, he mixed 2 spoons of 1 cheap white powder into a gallon of warm water, and he poured it on his tomatoes. 41 years he did this. His garden fed his family, his 3 grown children, and the local food pantry. The neighbors thought he was crazy. The extension office never told him to do it. His grandmother Eliza taught him during the Dust Bowl years when she fed 7 children on a quarter-acre plot. And she had learned it from a German immigrant named Otto Lindemann, who settled in southern Indiana around 1903. Otto brought it over from a village outside Stuttgart, where farmers had been using bittersalz, the German word for Epsom salt, in their kitchen gardens since the middle of the 1800s. The mineral itself was first found in the bitter springs near the English town of Epsom in Surrey back in 1618. When a farmer noticed his cows refused to drink from one particular spring on a parched summer day, the water, boiled down, left a bitter white residue that healed cuts and reduced swelling, and, as gardeners would later learn, did something remarkable to the soil and to the plants growing in it. So what is it, exactly? The chemical name for Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate heptahydrate. That is a mouthful, but in plain terms, it is 2 essential plant nutrients bound together with 7 molecules of water. Those 2 nutrients, magnesium and sulfur, happen to be precisely the 2 elements most chronically deficient in the tired, overworked, chemically fertilized soils of the modern American backyard. And the ratio Harold used was not something he invented, and not something Otto invented either. I went looking for how far back it went, and what I found surprised me. The earliest American written reference I could track down appears in a small pamphlet published in Cincinnati in 1887 by a German-language immigrant newspaper, the Cincinnati Volksblatt. Under the title Garden Work for the Householder, it recommended 2 tablespoons of bittersalz to 1 gallon of warm water, the exact same ratio Harold would use 90 years later in Indiana. That same ratio shows up again in a 1903 gardening manual published in Philadelphia by a horticulturalist named Margaret Whitfield, who attributed it to her grandfather, an English gardener who had emigrated from Surrey in 1851, just a few miles from the original Epsom Springs themselves, and it appears a 3rd time in a 1917 wartime gardening pamphlet from the United States Department of Agriculture, the one that encouraged Americans to plant victory gardens during the First World War, where it is recommended specifically for tomatoes and peppers and described as an inexpensive and effective method of increasing yields and reducing insect damage. The United States government printed this advice and handed it to citizens, but after 1917, the ratio quietly disappears from official USDA publications. It surfaces once more in a 1942 pamphlet for the Second World War victory gardens, and then it is gone again from the official literature for decades, surviving only in the oral traditions of immigrant communities and in the practices of older gardeners like Harold, who kept doing what their grandparents taught them regardless of what the extension office said. Magnesium got left out of modern fertilizer, sulfur got left out, and the pests noticed before anyone else did. Aphids noticed first, then cabbage moths, then squash bugs, then Japanese beetles. Because pests have an uncanny ability to detect weakness in a plant, to sense through chemical cues invisible to us that a tomato leaf is starving for magnesium or that a pepper plant is short on sulfur. And they descend on those weakened plants in numbers that can strip a garden bare in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee on the back porch. What Harold understood, and what Otto understood before him, and what Eliza understood in her dirt-floored kitchen during the worst years of the Dust Bowl, was this. A plant fed properly is a plant that pests largely leave alone. Not entirely. Nothing in nature is ever entirely anything, but largely. And the difference between a garden that needs constant spraying and a garden that essentially defends itself comes down to whether the gardener understands the simple, ancient, almost embarrassingly cheap secret of magnesium sulfate. Now, here is what the big agricultural chemical companies would rather you not understand, and what the extension offices have quietly downplayed for the better part of 70 years. And this is where I tell you about the 1950 study. In 1947, a soil scientist at Purdue University named Dr. Walter Henning began a 3-year study. He compared pest damage in tomato plots treated with weekly Epsom salt against control plots treated only with standard nitrogen fertilizer. The results were published in a now nearly forgotten bulletin from the Indiana Agricultural Experiment Station in the fall of 1950. According to that bulletin, the Epsom-treated plots experienced an average of 73% less aphid damage, 68% less hornworm damage, and a stunning 81% reduction in blossom end rot. Henning's bulletin was reprinted exactly once, in a small run of about 400 copies. Then it was quietly removed from circulation in 1953, around the same time the major agricultural chemical companies began significantly increasing their funding to land-grant universities across the Midwest. Whether there is a direct connection between those two events, I will leave for you to decide. But I will note that Henning himself, in a letter to his daughter dated November of 1961, wrote that he had been advised by certain colleagues that further research into magnesium sulfate would not be a productive use of his career. So he shifted his focus to nitrogen utilization in corn, where, in his own words, the funding was considerably more generous. The bulletin is still out there in the special collections of the Purdue Agricultural Library, where a researcher named Marjorie Vance tracked it down in 2003 while writing her master's thesis. But Henning was not alone, and this is the part that stopped me cold. What Marjorie discovered was that the same thing happened at 3 other universities. Similar studies were conducted at Ohio State in 1952, at the University of Wisconsin in 1955, and at Cornell in 1958. Every single one showed dramatic reductions in pest pressure and dramatic increases in yield. And every single one was either never published, published in an obscure journal, or actively withdrawn shortly after it appeared. The Wisconsin study was the most damning. It was conducted by a graduate student named Theodore Kowalczyk under the supervision of Dr. Eleanor Bishop. His 3-year study ran from May of 1955 through October of 1957. It tracked pest populations on 12 different vegetable crops across 40 separate test plots, and what he recorded was almost hard to believe. Cabbage moths showed an almost complete avoidance of cabbage plants treated with weekly Epsom applications. Kowalczyk recorded an average of 0.3 moth eggs per square foot of leaf on treated plants, compared to 37.8 eggs per square foot on untreated plants. That is not a typo. That is a difference of more than 2 orders of magnitude. The mechanism, Kowalczyk believed, had to do with the way magnesium affects the production of certain volatile compounds in plant tissue, the terpenoids and the glucosinolates, the compounds that give vegetables their characteristic smells and that also function as natural insect deterrents. A magnesium-starved plant produces these at reduced levels, which makes it more attractive to pests, which then weaken it further, in a downward spiral that ends with a bare stem. A magnesium-sufficient plant produces them at full strength, and pests, sensing the chemical equivalent of a no trespassing sign, move on to easier targets. But Kowalczyk's dissertation was never published. He took a job with an agricultural chemical company in Delaware in the spring of 1958. According to a brief and bitter interview he gave to a regional gardening magazine in 1979, he was told upon being hired that his dissertation research would not be discussed publicly and that any further work on magnesium sulfate would be considered a violation of his employment contract. He spent the rest of his career developing synthetic pesticides. He died in 1994. And here is the box I told you to stay for. When his daughter cleaned out his attic some years later, she found a single bound copy of his dissertation in a cardboard box marked in his own handwriting in heavy black marker with one word, roots. She donated it to the Wisconsin State Historical Society, where it remains for any researcher who knows to ask for it. A man who spent 40 years building synthetic pesticides kept the one study that pointed the other way, hidden in his attic, in a box he labeled with the word for the thing that holds a plant to the earth. Now, let me tell you what actually happens when you pour that solution around the base of your tomato. The magnesium sulfate dissolves into its component ions, positively charged magnesium and negatively charged sulfate, and these are immediately available to plant roots in a way that magnesium, locked up in solid soil minerals, is not. Most American garden soils, especially in the eastern half of the country, are chronically short on available magnesium, even when the total magnesium is plenty, because it is bound up in clay and released only slowly. But here is the trap. That problem is made dramatically worse by high potassium fertilizers, which is to say almost any commercial synthetic fertilizer, because potassium and magnesium compete for uptake at the root. When potassium is overabundant, magnesium uptake is suppressed, even when adequate magnesium is technically present. So you get a paradox that has frustrated soil scientists for decades. The very fertilizers you use to make your plants grow are simultaneously starving them of the magnesium they need. The Epsom solution bypasses this entirely. It delivers magnesium straight to the root zone in a form that is instantly available, no matter what else is happening in the soil. And the sulfur matters just as much, though it gets less attention. Sulfur builds certain amino acids, cysteine and methionine, the building blocks of plant proteins, and it powers those same defensive compounds Kowalczyk identified. American soils have grown steadily more sulfur deficient over the past 50 years, and the reason is something almost nobody connects to their garden. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 and 1990 dramatically reduced sulfur dioxide from coal plants. That was an environmental triumph. It ended acid rain and saved countless lakes and forests. But it had a side effect. The free sulfur that used to fall on our soil with every rainstorm as dilute sulfuric acid simply does not fall anymore. Epsom salt provides exactly the sulfur the rain no longer brings, in exactly the form plants can use, and it does it on a weekly schedule that closely mirrors the natural cycle of sulfur deposition that prevailed in American gardens for most of the 20th century. So you are not doing something exotic or strange when you pour that solution. You are restoring a balance that used to maintain itself through processes in the sky that no longer operate, and you are giving your plants two essential nutrients they cannot reliably get any other practical way. There is something worth sitting with in that. For most of the 20th century, every thunderstorm that rolled across Indiana was quietly fertilizing Harold's grandmother's garden, dropping a fine mist of sulfur with every rain. Eliza never knew it. She did not need to. She just knew that when she added the bitter salves, her plants did better, and she passed that down to Harold the way you pass down a recipe, without the chemistry, just the result. By the time Harold was an old man, the rain had stopped carrying that sulfur, and the gardeners who had abandoned the bitter salves had no idea why their tired soil kept getting more tired. Harold's soil never got the message, because Harold never stopped feeding it the thing the rain used to. Harold knew none of the chemistry, of course. He just did what his grandmother taught him. There is a story his daughter told me about June of 1983, when a neighbor came over to complain that hornworms had wiped out his tomato patch overnight. The neighbor stood at the fence, furious, asking Harold what he sprayed. Harold told him the truth. 2 spoons of Epsom salt in a gallon of warm water every Sunday. The neighbor looked at him like he was being mocked, turned around and went to the hardware store to buy chemical spray instead. Harold just shrugged and went back to his watering can. His plants that year, by the way, produced so heavily he was leaving paper bags of tomatoes on doorsteps up and down the road. So here is the protocol, and the details matter. The basic ratio is 2 tablespoons of Epsom salt to 1 gallon of warm water. Tablespoons, not teaspoons. This trips people up constantly, and a teaspoon recipe delivers only a third of what you need. Warm the water to about 90 degrees, warm to the touch but not hot, roughly cooled bath water. Stir with a wooden or plastic spoon, never metal, because metal can react with the sulfate ions and cut the effectiveness, a detail Otto Lindemann reportedly insisted on and Harold followed for 4 decades. Stir until the water goes from cloudy to crystal clear, about 30 seconds. Pour it directly at the base of each plant, into the soil within about 6 inches of the main stem, where the feeder roots are. Do not pour it on the leaves. At this concentration, foliar application can burn the leaves, especially in sun or heat. Apply within 4 hours of mixing because the solution starts losing strength as it sits. And apply in the early morning, before 8 o'clock, when the soil is cool and the solution penetrates before evaporation pulls the salts to the surface. The amount changes a little by plant. For mature tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, about 1 full cup per plant, once a week. For brassicas, that is cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and Brussels sprouts, use 3/4 of a cup, but twice a week because brassicas absorb magnesium more slowly and want more consistent exposure. The rest of the chart, the squash and the leafy greens and the root crops and the herbs, I will keep simple. Smaller and leafier plants get less, about half a cup once a week. Root crops get half a cup every 2 weeks, because too much magnesium early can deform the roots. Now let me walk you through how this fits into a season, because the timing matters as much as the ratio. In late winter, when you are starting seeds indoors under lights, you do not use Epsom salt at all. The seedlings' root systems are too small and too delicate to benefit, and excess magnesium at that stage can actually slow germination. Plain water only. When you harden the seedlings off and move them outside, still plain water. Water them in thoroughly at transplant, and then wait. This is the part people skip, and it matters. You wait about 2 weeks after the seedlings go into the ground until the transplant shock has resolved and the new roots are reaching out, because only then are the plants physiologically ready to take advantage of the extra nutrition. Harold always started on a Sunday, partly because it was easier to remember a weekly task tied to the same day, and partly, he told his daughter, because his grandmother had done it on Sundays before him. So pick your day and keep it. Then repeat every 7 days, all season, until about 3 weeks before your first expected frost, when you stop to let the plants wind down naturally. Applications too late in the year interfere with that natural winding down and can actually reduce the cold hardiness of your perennial herbs. One more timing note. Do not apply right before a heavy rain, because the rain will dilute the solution and wash it below the root zone before the plant can absorb it. If rain is in the forecast, wait until it passes and the soil has begun to dry, then apply to lightly moist soil rather than saturated ground. 2 spoons of Epsom salt, 1 gallon of warm water. Everything I have pulled from these old gardeners, every method, every buried study, every technique from this channel is gathered in one place in the description below. It is called the Amish Home System. Now stay right here, because what comes next is the part I built this whole video around. By the 3rd or 4th week of applications, you will start to see the changes with your own eyes. The leaves will be a darker, more vibrant green, because chlorophyll molecules require magnesium at their very core, so more magnesium means more chlorophyll, which means more photosynthesis, which means faster growth. The stems will be thicker and sturdier because the extra sulfur builds the structural proteins that give plant tissue its strength. The flowers, when they come, will be larger and more numerous because magnesium powers the production of ATP, the energy molecule behind all the work of flowering and fruiting. And the pests will be noticeably fewer, not gone. Nothing short of toxic chemical warfare makes pests vanish entirely, and anyone who promises you otherwise is selling something, but they drop to a level you can manage by hand. Aphid colonies that would have exploded into thousands stay at a few dozen, knocked back with a spray from the garden hose. Cabbage moths that would have laid hundreds of eggs on a single broccoli plant largely avoid your garden and lay them on the unprotected brassicas in your neighbor's yard instead. Hornworms still come, but in ones and twos rather than dozens, and they are so weakened by the unpalatable leaf tissue that many die before they grow large enough to do real damage. The yield is the part that sounds like an exaggeration until you see it. Henning's 1,950 bulletin reported average yield increases of 43% for tomatoes, 38% for peppers, and 51% for summer squash in his treated plots. More recent, informal trials by master gardeners who quietly experimented despite official indifference have reported similar numbers, with one Iowa master gardener documenting a 62% increase in tomato yield in 2009 after switching to weekly Epsom applications. The fruit itself is larger, denser, and more flavorful, because the extra magnesium and sulfur support the sugars and organic acids that give vegetables their taste. A tomato grown this way carries a measurably higher Brix reading, which is to say a higher dissolved sugar content and higher concentrations of lycopene, the red antioxidant pigment, linked in study after study to better health. So you might ask, if it is this simple and this well documented, why is it not standard practice? Why is every gardening book in America not recommending it? And the honest answer comes down mostly to money. There is no money in Epsom salt. A 4-pound bag costs under $5 and lasts 2 or 3 seasons. There is no patent on magnesium sulfate. There is no proprietary formula. There is no brand name to advertise, no exclusive distribution deal, no chemical company that profits when more gardeners adopt the practice. Compare that to synthetic pesticides, which are patent-protected, brand-name products with profit margins in the hundreds of percent and marketing budgets in the millions. The companies that make them have every incentive to promote them and to discourage anything that would reduce demand. Extension offices, which take substantial funding from agricultural chemical companies, feel the same gravitational pull, even when the individual agents are honest, well-meaning people, which most of them are. And there is a cultural piece too. Since the 1950s, we have been trained to believe that complex problems require complex solutions, and that an old folk practice tied to grandmothers in the Dust Bowl must be inferior to a modern product in a labeled bottle. So a practice that is grounded in solid soil chemistry gets dismissed at the level of style before anyone bothers to look at the evidence. There is an institutional piece on top of that. Agricultural science in this country runs through the land-grant university system set up back in 1862, and those universities were built to serve large-scale commercial agriculture, not the backyard gardener. Research priorities follow the funding, and the funding follows commercial interests that have no stake in the productivity of your tomato bed. So a practice that is enormously useful for a home garden but irrelevant to a 1,000-acre corn operation simply falls through the cracks. Nobody pays to study it. And when somebody does study it, an isolated researcher like Henning or Kowalczyk pursuing it as a side project, the result never gets distributed because there is no machinery built to distribute it. So the knowledge survives in pockets, in immigrant communities, in the practices of old gardeners, in the dusty bulletins of state experiment stations from the 1940s and 50s, but it never quite breaks through to the mainstream, no matter how many times an individual gardener rediscovers it and tries to share it. Now, I want to be fair, because there are honest objections and they deserve straight answers. The most common is that Epsom salt can oversupply magnesium and suppress calcium uptake, leading to disorders like blossom end rot. Calcium and magnesium do compete at the root, so the concern is real in principle. But at the weekly home garden rate I described, the amount of magnesium delivered is well below the threshold where calcium suppression becomes a problem in most soils, and far less than the calcium already present in even lightly limed ground. In fact, the historical studies showed reductions in blossom end rot in treated plots, not increases. The second objection is sulfate buildup in the soil over time. That has merit in dry regions with high evaporation and little rain to flush the salts through, and there you should add a deep monthly soaking to carry the sulfates below the root zone. But east of the Mississippi, where rain exceeds 30 inches a year and natural leaching keeps salinity low, it is simply not a practical concern. The third objection I hear is that the pest effect has not been confirmed in modern peer-reviewed studies, and that the evidence I have given you is old. That is partly true in the narrow sense that there are very few recent studies of these exact protocols. But that absence is the institutional problem I just described, not the absence of an effect. The old studies, imperfect by today's standards, were still controlled experiments with proper control groups and replications run by trained scientists at major universities, and they agreed with one another across more than a decade. And there is a fourth objection, the one I find most honest of all, which is that the pest reduction might come simply from healthier plants rather than any special anti-pest magic. There is truth in that. Healthy plants resist pests better. Full stop. But Epsom salt has specific advantages a bag of synthetic fertilizer does not. It delivers magnesium and sulfur in immediately usable form. It contains no nitrogen, so it does not push the soft, sappy growth that aphids love. And it does no harm to the bees, the earthworms, or the soil microbes that a synthetic pesticide would wipe out alongside the pest. Take every one of these objections seriously, apply the protocol at the rate I gave you, and not one of them will trouble your garden. Now let me tell you what happened to Harold's garden. By the time he passed away in 2019, at the age of 87, his tenth of an acre had become a local legend in Millbrook. It produced an extraordinary quantity of vegetables every year, enough to feed Harold and his wife Doris, to keep their 3 grown children supplied with care packages, and to stock the local food pantry from June through October. Visitors always said the same thing, that the garden seemed somehow more alive than other gardens. The leaves greener, the stems thicker, the air humming with bees. There were almost no pest problems. Harold grumbled about Japanese beetles in July, but it was more about principle than damage, because his plants shrugged off pressure that would have flattened weaker gardens. He never sprayed anything. After Harold died, his daughter Margaret kept the garden going for one more season, following his protocols exactly as she had learned them helping him as a child. That last full season, 2020, 12 tomato plants produced an estimated 470 pounds of fruit, more than 39 pounds per plant. The peppers produced about 220 pounds. The squash, more than 300. These numbers are not guesses. The food pantry weighed every donation for tax purposes, and the records were kept by the pantry director, a retired school teacher named Eunice Whitlock, who knew they represented something worth preserving. The average American backyard garden, according to the National Gardening Association, produces about half a pound of vegetables per square foot per season. Harold's produced roughly 3 pounds per square foot, 6 times the national average. Same ordinary Midwestern climate, same kind of soil as his neighbors, same varieties anyone can buy from any catalog. The only real difference was 2 spoons of Epsom salt in a gallon of warm water every Sunday for 41 years. After the property sold in 2021, the new owners tore out the garden and put down lawn, because that is what people do now. And the soil 4 generations had built up has been under bluegrass, sod, and synthetic lawn chemicals ever since. Margaret, who lives in Cincinnati now, told me last autumn that losing the garden was harder than losing her father, because the garden was everything he believed about how people should treat the earth, and watching it vanish into anonymous lawn felt like watching knowledge being erased. So she started her own small garden in her Cincinnati backyard, following his protocols, and after only 3 seasons, her tomato production has roughly doubled compared to her neighbors, and her pest pressure is so low that those neighbors have started asking her what her secret is. She tells them the truth. 2 spoons of Epsom salt in a gallon of warm water once a week. And most of them, she says, look at her like she is making fun of them because the answer is too simple to be believed, but a few have tried it. And those few came back a season later and told her it worked exactly as she said, and they have started telling their own neighbors, and the knowledge is spreading outward through her Cincinnati street the same way it spread through Harold's Millbrook for 4 decades, person by person, garden by garden, the way real knowledge has always traveled, hand to hand and mouth to mouth, for as long as people have been growing food. 2 spoons of Epsom salt, 1 gallon of warm water once a week. That is what Eliza taught Harold during the Dust Bowl. That is what Harold taught Margaret on Sunday mornings. And that is what I am telling you now. Do it this Sunday on whatever you already have in the ground. Then tell me down in the comments what state you garden in and what your grandparents grew, because I read every one and your stories are how I find the next thing to track down. And if this gave you back something that should never have been taken from you, subscribe and stay with us, because there is a whole community here recovering what our grandparents knew and our parents lost. Next time, I am traveling back to Lancaster County to document how the Amish keep their root cellars at a steady 50 degrees through an Ohio August with no electricity at all, using nothing but straw, sawdust, and one ingredient you would never expect. But for now, go find that $4 bag, 2 spoons, 1 gallon, this Sunday, and watch what your garden does by August.